Hello everyone, welcome to the second video of this series about Introduction to Managerial Accounting, and on this video I'm going to talk with you about direct and indirect costs. Now for that we have to understand that direct and indirect costs are basically the way that we divide our costs when it comes to actually understanding the costs that we have in a factory or the costs that we have producing a product. So first of all, let's understand what is a cost. A cost is a sacrifice made to obtain some benefit. And if you notice, I said a sacrifice, not directly money that we spend, because sometimes costs are not necessarily money we spend. But that's a discussion for another day. For now, we're going to keep on the assumption that costs are money that we spend, or costs are something that we used in order to be able to produce a certain article. Now, for us to be able to define or to divide our costs in categories that will help us, first we have to as well understand a new concept, which is the concept of cost object. Cost object is the relationship the cost has to a segment of the operations. And we can have cost objects related to products, related to sales territories, related to departments, related to a variety of things. Mostly for now, we're going to focus on costs that are associated with products. The two costs, therefore, like I said, we have direct costs. Direct costs are identified with and can be traced to a cost object. In other words, those are costs that I can identify in my finished product and are costs that I can trace to my finished product. In other words, costs that are absolutely necessary to create my finished product. And therefore, they are an integral part of that finished product. So for example, the leather that I use to produce the purses, that's a direct cost because I can see it directly on my product. But on the other hand, indirect costs are basically costs that cannot be identified with or traced to a cost object. So for example, if I have a staff supervisor in the factory and he supervises all the work that is being done by other members in the cutting or in the sewing department, but he's not actually cutting or sewing any of the purses. Actually, he barely touches the purses, and therefore he would be considered an indirect cost because he's not an integral part of the production cycle. So for us to understand this, then I put here this little diagram. First of all, we have to identify what is the cost object. And in this case, my cost object is the purse that I'm producing. Then I have to ask the question, can the cost be identified and traced? So if it can, if yes, then it's a direct cost. If no, then it's an indirect cost. So in order for us to understand the cost of a finished product, the cost of manufacturing a product, we have to understand there are three different types of costs. There is costs that we call direct material costs. So this is costs, important materials that I need to produce my product. Okay, in this case, I'm giving the example, the leather for the purse or the lining that goes inside the purse, for example. Those are materials that are very important and therefore I can see them and they are an important part of my product. The second one is direct labor cost, and here we're talking, for example, about people that work in the cutting department, people that work in the sewing department. In other words, they work directly with the product. And finally, the third category, we call it factory overhead costs. So in order to give a little bit more detail, direct material costs. This is, well, manufactured products, they always begin with raw materials, and those raw materials will be transformed into a finished product. In this case, leather and lining will go into creating a purse. Now, but to be called a direct material cost, the cost must be both two things. Number one, it must be an integral part of the finished product, and it also must be a significant portion of the total cost of the product. So, as an example, like I said before, we have many materials to do a purse, but in this case I selected leather and the filling that goes inside the purse. Why did I select those? Because, well, they are important costs and there are big parts of the cost when it comes to material, and therefore, can I see them on the product? Yes, I can. Are they an important part when it comes to the overall cost of the product? Yes, they are, and therefore I place them as direct costs. Indirect cost, on the other hand, is just because either they only meet one of the categories or none. And here, for example, we have these little pieces of string that I use to tie all the pieces of the leather with the lining, for example. But the quantity that I use is so small that therefore does not obey the second one, a significant portion of the total cost of the product, and therefore it's an indirect cost. The zipper as well. Some of the purses I produce maybe don't even have zippers, or they have only some of them will have some zippers. Therefore, it's not a very important part of the product. It's not absolutely necessary, and therefore it would also be considered an indirect cost. So direct costs, they are an important component of the product, while indirect costs, they are still important, don't get me wrong, but they're not that important. The second, so for a couple more examples, just to give you an idea. For example, the wood that I use to produce guitars, electronics that I use to produce TVs, paper that we use to produce a book, tires that we use to produce a car, all of those things are direct material costs. The second category of cost we had is direct labor. Now, this is the cost that employs wages, that it's also an integral part of the finished product. And therefore, its direct labor cost must be two things again. Number one, must be an important part, an integral part of the finished product, and it also must be a significant portion of the total cost. So typically, the definition I would say here is people that have an important work on the product. So for example, the sewing department, all right, is therefore and definitely a direct labor cost, because they are a very important part when it comes to producing our purse. But for example, the cost of the janitor that cleans, for example, the factory, they don't work directly with the product. And even if we were to divide his salary among all the products that we create, the proportion would be so small that therefore it's not an integral or an important part of creating the product. And therefore, we would consider it indirect labor. So some more examples of direct labor. For example, someone cutting wood to produce guitars, a mechanic that fixes a car, a writer that writes a book, a factory assembler worker that produces computers. All these people are people that are important to the production, yes, but they also contribute a major part of creating the product, and therefore they are direct labor too. Finally, factory overhead cost. This is basically all the other costs that we did not cover. So any cost that is not direct labor cost, any cost that is not direct material cost, it's factory overhead costs. This is costs that are not the previous two categories. And all the costs here are indirect costs of the product. So I put some examples here. Once again, you see here the lining, once again, the zippers, the janitor, the supervisor, all those costs is indirect, but there's more as well. For example, electricity is a factory overhead cost. Water, for example, gasoline for the trucks, and so on. Some more examples here. The heating and lighting in the factory, repairing and maintaining factory equipment, for example, property taxes on the buildings, insurance, depreciation of the equipment. This is all factory overhead costs. I still need these costs to produce my product, but they're not as important as the previous two that I mentioned. So to summarize here, I just want to say that we learned a couple of things, but the most important thing is that all the costs of production are divided into three categories: direct material costs, costs that are integral to creating the product, but also they represent a good proportion of the total cost of the product. Then we have direct labor costs, same two rules as before, integral part of production, or it also represents a good portion of the costs of the final product. And finally, the third one we have was factory overhead cost, any cost that does not fall in the previous category. With these three costs, we're going to be able later on to calculate the price, for example, of creating a product and how much does it cost to actually produce it. All right. Okay. Thank you very much. Let me know if you have questions on the comments below, and I'll see you on the next video.